Okay, I think while we figure that out, I will go ahead and get started with a few announcements before we actually begin the performance. Um, Firstly, I want to say that this event is part of a series organized by the Society for Arab Music Research, which is part of the Society for Ethnomusicology, and the Society for Ethnomusicology Ceasefire Collective. So thank you very much to both of those organizations for all of your help in organizing this event. Part of the reason that we are organizing this series of events is to help create more space to talk about Palestine in academic contexts, and also to mobilize our academic networks to support the people in Palestine, wherever they may be, but especially right now in Gaza. So before we begin, maybe we can take just a moment of silence in honor of the people who have been killed in Gaza or are currently suffering. Okay, thank you very much for taking that time. Before I pass it over to Sarah, I want to make you all aware of two more upcoming events that are a part of this series. One on Tuesday, March 19th at 2 p.m. EDT, 7 p.m. GMT. There will be an event featuring Gil Hochberg, David McDonald, and Shayna Silverstein, titled Embodied Histories and Imaginal Futures in Levantine Arts and Cultural Practice. It will be wonderful, so please join. If you need further information about getting access to that Zoom link, I will post it in the chat in a bit. Secondly, the Society for Arab Music Research is also accepting proposals for an upcoming online symposium on digital music cultures in the Arab world with the International Council for Traditional Music and Dance Study Group on Music in the Arab World. Submissions are due by May 25th, 2024. Sorry, the event is May 25th, 2024, and submissions for proposals are due by March 15th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I can put those links in the chat as well. But for today's event, we're very excited to welcome Sarah Abusarar here with us to tell stories. Sarah comes from a long line of storytellers on her paternal side. She tells stories both to adults and children, and she tells stories nationally and internationally, and she's been featured at festivals in Canada, Italy, Croatia, Morocco, and the United Arab Emirates. She was raised in multiple countries, but Sarah tells stories from all over the world, especially focusing on stories from Palestine and Croatia, which is where her roots lie. Her favorite stories are ones that promote social change, and she employs storytelling as therapy for children in refugee camps and refugee children in Toronto. She currently works for the Toronto Parent-Child Mother Goose program using traditional storytelling to encourage parent-child bonding. Additionally, Sarah Abusarar belongs to a collective called Musical Story Studio, where stories and music are combined in performance and through interactive workshops. Abusarar enjoys telling stories that transport people to faraway magical places that she remembers from long, long ago. So welcome, Sarah, and thank you so much for joining us here today. As she tells her stories, please remember that today's event is a fundraiser for the United Nations Refugee Works Association. So please consider donating to this organization in honor of Sarah's performance today. Thank you, Sarah, and I will pass it over to you.
Thank you for coming today, and I think people will be joining in as I tell. Since the genocide began in Palestine, I have mostly been telling traditional stories because I find it too difficult to tell family stories right now. But when I was invited to do this, I thought this would be the right space for family stories. And so these are true stories that I grew up. These are stories that I grew up with. My father told them to me, and they're stories from my father's childhood. And feel free to turn on your cameras if you wish. My grandmother, Sara Abusarar, whom I was named after, was a storyteller. She inherited this important role from her mother, who was also a storyteller. My great grandmother's mother's family lived in the same village in Hebron Hills for 1,500 years. And before that, they could trace their roots back to Yemen and Egypt. My great grandmother's family lived in that village for so long that when my great grandmother told her stories, she could describe every snake that ever slithered down those hills. And my grandmother's father was SAMR, Philistine. The Sumerians were there long before the Arabs and the Jews. And my grandmother's father was a blind man. And because at that time, not all children went to school, my grandmother stayed behind and she became my great grandfather's eyes. And once a month, my great grandmother would take my great grandfather by his hand and she would lead him along the path towards Hebron City to do his shopping. And my Judith could hardly contain herself because she knew that the last shop that they would enter would be the shop of her two best friends, two little Jewish girls. Now, I know it might seem strange to you now, especially now, that my Muslim Palestinian grandmother would have two little Jewish girls as her best friends. But you see, that was before 1920, when Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, and Palestinian Jews all mingled together. And the only time religion ever came up was during times of holidays, and only to wish each other a happy holiday. My father remembers my grandmother painting Easter eggs every Easter. And one day when my father was already older, he asked my grandmother, "Why do you paint Easter eggs? For you are not Christian." And my Jidity looked at my father and she said, "Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and Bethlehem is in Palestine, and so Easter is not a Christian holiday, but a Palestinian holiday." And she continued to paint those Easter eggs until she died at age 96. Now back to my grandmother and the two little Jewish girls. Being city girls, those two girls went to school, and so they knew how to read. And they would sit my grandmother down and they would read books to her. And even though my grandmother grew up listening to stories from her mother and her grandmother every day, these stories were extra special to her because they came from books and they were read to her by her two best friends. And then my grandmother grew. And when she was 16 years old, she married and she gave birth to my father, whom she named Isa, meaning Jesus in Arabic, Abusarar. He was born on January 31st, 1948. Just a few months before the Nakba, the catastrophe. Palestinians were divided. The British had given parts of Palestine to the Zionists, leaving the other parts untouched. A land without a people, for a people without a land, they echoed. A land without a people. But there were people there. My father was there. Palestinians fled in all directions. Most went to neighboring countries like Jordan and Lebanon and Syria. And some went farther to Greece, and many went to Chile. And then there were those, perhaps the most unfortunate of all, who walked to the neighboring Palestinian villages and towns not yet occupied. And they became refugees on their own land. Many of those people went to Hebron City, and there was a refugee camp for them there, but it was so small, so overcrowded, so insufficient. Tent next to a tent next to a tent. And so in 1952, a very wealthy and yet generous man donated his best land. And he built a second refugee camp for these people, the Al-Fawar refugee camp. In that same year that Al-Fawar refugee camp was built, my 4-year-old father had some troubles of his own. His little sister, the one whom he played with and later took care of, she died of brain cancer, leaving my father a sad little boy with nobody to play with. Why, he could either play with children much older than him or little babies. And so he sat alone. And every evening he would see his grandmother sitting underneath the fig tree, building a home made out of stones. And my father was sure that she was playing without him. And so when she wasn't looking, he hid behind that tree and bang, he destroyed her home. And my great-grandmother, without saying a word, just picked up those stones and she rebuilt her home. And my father walked back to that large circle of women, storytellers telling stories. My grandmother on one side and my great-grandmother on the other. And my father would take some chestnuts and sometimes even potatoes. Then they would really have a party and throw them inside of the fire. And he sat next to his mother and he listened to those stories. Fairy tales were his favorite. He listened to every word in hopes that one day he could tell those stories to his own children. But my father never told us fairy tales. He stopped believing in magic. He told us real life stories that, like fairy tales, contained kings, brave young men and monsters. He didn't share those stories much, but when he did, he paused frequently to stop his tears from falling. See that mountain over there, Sada? When I was a child, there was a helicopter parked on that mountain every day. Every day they watched us. They watched us as we ate. And they did not pause to stop watching us as we played. It was like that helicopter was part of that mountain. Times were different then. My father's stories always began this way. And in the end, my brother and I wonder how different they really were. Times were different then. The refugee women began their days at 5 a.m. Barefoot they walked from their camp in Al-Fawar to my grandmother's land in Dura, Hebron, to pick a cactus-like plant, myrrh. And they would place that plant upon their heads, and with their crowns of thorns, they walked all the way to Hebron city. It was noon by the time they arrived, and they lined up in the bakery, the sun beating upon the roofs of their heads as they waited to exchange their thorns for one piece of pita bread, which they would then give to their children to eat. And late at night, when the children had finally fallen asleep, often after crying of hunger pains, the women finally got to rest their feet. With keys in their hands, they reminisced of a time when they too had a home, with rows of rows, with oranges and rows of lemon trees along the sea. One day, early in the morning, my 4-year-old father was going to town with my grandmother when they spotted those women walking with their crowns of thorns. My father stopped. His eyes focused on the youngest of the women. A thorn had pierced through her temple, and a drop of blood was rolling down her cheek. Father watched as the woman leaned towards the well to drink a little bit of water and maybe to wipe the blood off of her face. When the owner of the well ran outside his home, yelling at the woman, forbidding her from drinking from his well. My father hid behind my grandmother, and he peeked from her dress. He saw the woman. She dropped the thorns on the ground, blood now pouring down her face, tears dropping to the ground. She said, Allah, when this man dies, may he not have enough water to wash his body with. My grandmother picked up my father She held him close to her heart, and she carried him away. A year later, there was a closure. And much like the closures in Palestine today, during a closure, one cannot leave their house, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, and sometimes even for weeks. And during that closure, the man at the well, the one who forbid the woman from drinking from his well, he died. His wife begged the authorities, the Jordanian authorities, to please let her out of her home just to bury her husband's body. The authorities allowed her to go as far as the graveyard to bury his body, but not a few steps further to the mosque to wash his body. Now remember what the refugee woman asked Allah? That man was the only man in the village to have ever been buried without first being washed. Times were different then. World War II had just ended. World War II had just ended, and poverty quickly seeped into the Hebron Hills. Most people could not afford clothes or shoes for their children. The refugee children walked from Al-Fawar refugee camp to their school in Dura, Hebron. Barefoot they walked, with the cold wind slapping their faces. Lips cracked, cheeks chapped. They walked with haste, all the while shivering. You remember the winter in Hebron, Sarah? You could hardly take the cold. Well, the wooden stoves you see in the classrooms now were not there back then. The only thing keeping the children warm were the stone walls. The refugee children arrived in their classrooms, blowing on their fingers, blowing on their hands, trying but unable to focus on their lessons. The school bell would ring and the teacher would come inside. More often than not, he would pick on one of the students in bare feet. More often than not, the children were far too focused on their own shivers to reply. And the teacher would take a ruler and sometimes even his belt and hit the children on their frozen hands. These were segregated schools. The refugee children were in separate classrooms than the West Bank children. The principal, who had moved to Hebron City from Nablus and did not know the refugee experience, thought that the refugee children would be negative influences on the West Bank children. He told the teachers to have stricter rules for the refugee children. They abided by harsher rules, and they endured heavier punishments. And while the teachers had to be careful how they treated the West Bank children, for their parents would complain, they could do as they wished to the refugee children, because their parents had no rights, because they were just refugees. But slowly, Slowly, the children began to see each other in the playground. They began to play with each other and to share stories. And it is through those stories that the West Bank children quickly learned that what they were told about the refugee children was neither fair nor true. Just then, one of the refugee children came to the schoolyard with his little hand bleeding. The teacher had taken the punishment to an extreme and abused the child to the point of blood. The West Bank children were outraged. They huddled together and they came up with a plan. These grade 2 boys refused to go back inside of those classrooms until the segregated schools were abolished and everybody shared the same classroom and abided by the same rules. These 7-year-old boys walked from their school in Dura, Hebron, all the way to Hebron City to demand to speak with the Minister of Education. My father was amongst them. And when they arrived, the Minister of Education was surprised to see the boys. Ahlan, he welcomed them inside. My father watched as the Minister of Education leaned upon his desk. My father watched as the students' voices echoed one upon the other, upon the other. My father watched as the line in between the Minister of Education's forehead deepened with each word that he heard. And when he was finished, when they were finished, my father watched as the Minister of Education rose up. He told the students that he had no idea what was happening in one of his own schools. He immediately fired that principal, and the segregated classrooms were abolished. And the boys walked back to their classrooms feeling an inch taller. That was the first of the schoolyard resistance, and one of many, and my father took part in it. Times were different then. Palestine was a British colony and under harsh Jordanian rule. And although this cannot be found in too many history books, being a British colony, Palestinians fought alongside the British against the fascists. And although this is not often spoken about, many Palestinians lost their male breadwinners. Furthermore, Palestinians faced the same post-World War II recession endured by the European countries. Furthermore, Hebron being on the border of the parts of Palestine that were occupied in 1948, those in the southern Hebron Hills faced the same post-World War II recession endured by the European countries and also lost some of their best land. My family was amongst those who lost their best land. But being farmers, my family was relatively wealthy. Their wealth came from growing their own food. And so my father always had food to eat and shoes to wear. This was not true for most of the children in my father's class. My father remembers in his grade 2 class a little boy who came to school every day, and for lunch, he would take out a piece of bread that had a strong smell of kerosene. My father remembered the boy so clearly. He wore shorts that were far too small for him every day of the year, even in the coldest of winters. And my father remembers the little boy taking a bite of that bread and forcing it down, and the sad expression upon his face as the bread went into his stomach. And one day, my father gathered enough courage to ask this little boy why his khubza smelled like kerosene. And the little boy told my father. He said that his mother had a large bag of flour. At that time, the refugees would get aid from many countries, and it was mostly from Canada, actually, which doesn't happen anymore. And often you would see children walking around in shorts and then heavy Canadian winter coats, even all through the year, because that's all they got in the package. And they took what they got. And they would also get food and large bags of flour. And one day, the mother was sewing in the middle of the night in front of a lamp lit by kerosene. And she had accidentally knocked out the lamp, and the kerosene spilled onto the flour. And because they couldn't afford to get more flour, they continued to use that flour until the flour was spent. And this is why this little boy's khubza smelled like kerosene. Times were different then. Even though most of the boys in my father's grade 5 class could not afford shoes to wear, the teacher decided to pick on one of the students in bare feet. He told him that he could not come back to school until he wore shoes. The students were outraged. They knew that this little boy could not afford shoes. And so once again, the boys huddled together and they came up with a plan. And the next day, when the school bell rang, all the boys, including my father, walked inside of that classroom in bare feet. And when the teacher came into the class and he saw all the students in bare feet, he laughed louder than my father had ever heard him laugh before. And then he too took off his shoes and he taught the rest of the lesson in bare feet. Times were different then. The hierarchy was clear. The principal always arrived in the schoolyard first, and then the teachers. And the children, the high school students, would arrive last. Always last. Well, on this particular day, when my father entered his high school, he saw the principal already there, pacing back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth. My father watched as the principal took his strongest students and they huddled together. My father watched. The serious expression on the students' faces as the principal's hand waved as he spoke. My father watched as the student leaders dispersed and they began to chant. Down with the king! Down with the king! The students began to mingle with the other students. And the other students joined in. Down with the king! Down with the king! One of the student leaders approached my father. Israel is about to occupy Hebron. And the king of Jordan is refusing to allow the principal to teach us armed resistance. If we don't learn armed resistance, we too will be occupied. Down with the king! Down with the king! My father joined in. My father watched as the students dispersed and the student leaders walked to the center of Hebron city. The principal had asked the student leaders to mobilize and to begin a student strike. He had asked them to go to Hebron city and to refuse to go back inside of the classrooms until their demands were met. He asked them to tell the other students to go home every day and come back the next day with their backpacks on as if they were going to school, but to stay in the schoolyard and not come in. Down with the king! Down with the king! The student leaders arrived on the streets of Hebron city. Has anybody here been to Hebron city? Hanna, have you been to Hebron? Tell us, tell the people of the audience what my city looks like.
It's a lot of thin stone streets that wind in between buildings and sort of stack on top of each other.
Exactly. And they entered those streets and they joined the hustle and the bustle of Hebron city. Hebron city is always packed with the people. The shops and the restaurants are open all through the nights, and the student leaders joined the hustle and bustle of that noise. Down with the king! Down with the king! Hebron city is known for its merchants. They have the best merchants in all of Palestine, and the shops began to close down one by one as the parents noticed their sons on the street and decided to join them for safety. Down with the king! Down with the king! Their voices multiplied by the second. But it didn't take long for the king of Jordan to hear of the chaos in Hebron city. He immediately sent the Bedouin army, and the student strikes were stopped. And the boys were met at their schoolyard by the authorities, and they were arrested. And while in jail, no matter how much torture and beatings they endured, the student leaders refused to admit to the authorities that the principal was behind those strikes. We, the students, we came up with this idea and we followed it through. And this time, the rest of the students did not wait to be prompted by their principal. They hit the streets of Hebron City and they demanded an immediate release of their friends. They battled with the authorities for 2 weeks. And at the end of the 2 weeks, the student leaders were released. And all the boys walked back to that schoolyard together. And when they reached the gates of the school, they were met by their principal, who looked at the students with so much love and so much pride. And after that day, the hierarchy was no more. The principal treated with students with so much respect, and he always stood up for them as they stood up for him. That was the first of the real resistance that these students faced. But sadly, their requests were not met. And the following year, 1967, Hebron was occupied. My father is now 76 years old. And about 10 years ago, he found himself at the Ben Hur airport in Israel. And as many of you know, in Israel, everyone has to serve in the military, whether they believe in the occupation or not. And there are many people who resist it, and they are arrested, Israelis. And they can either serve frontline or they could serve in another capacity. And so at the airport, he encountered a young woman, 18 years old, who was serving her military sentence at the airport. And she took my father's passport, and under the birthplace, it said Palestine. And now, for those of you who are Canadians, this is not going to be on my father's passport anymore. They have just changed the law, and my father will no longer have a country for his birthplace. Instead, it's going to say born in no country. So my father, I don't have a human father anymore. My father was born at the moon, maybe, or in the sun, but no country. But at that time, and right now, it still says Palestine. And she looked at my father sharply, and she was sure that my father had falsified his passport. And she asked him, "Why does your passport say Palestine on it? There's no such country as Palestine." And my father looked at that young girl, and with the same love that he has in his voice when he's speaking to me, he said, "Because I am older than the occupation." And she took that passport roughly from his hand, and she marched on over to her superior, who of course said to her that indeed my father was a senior to the occupation. And so she marched back down to my father. She handed him his passport, and she said, "Welcome home." Home. My grandmother was my home. And so when she died, I was sure that I would never go to Palestine again. And yet I did. I went back to collect my grandmother's stories. And when I arrived, I found that my grandmother had left me her home, the home where my father was born. She had left her grandchild living the farthest away in diaspora, her home. Perhaps it was her way of saying that I will one day return. And late at night, I often can't sleep, and yet I dream. I dream of a free Palestine. I sit underneath my favorite tree, the charuba, and I look at the sun kissing the sea in Gaza good night. I see a little boy on the beach. He's building a home made out of sand. He looks so much like my brother when he was a little boy. I wave at him from the mountains, and he waves at me from the sea. I chose for this fundraiser to be for UNRWA because I spent some time without knowing that the refugee camp where these stories came from Al Fawar refugee camp. Without knowing that, when I went to collect my grandmother's stories, I found myself in Al Fawar refugee camp working on my master's thesis, doing an expressive art therapy group. After I came back, my father said, these are where the stories you grew up on came from. But I didn't know that. Just like I didn't know that I came from a family of storytellers until I became a storyteller. It just happened by chance. And I found myself with these boys I worked with grade 5 boys. I chose grade 5 boys, 10-year-old boys, because that's around the time that Palestinian children in the camps begin with the stone throwing. And as a Palestinian who's living in Canada in safety, I cannot condemn these boys for throwing stones at tanks that have come into their refugee camp. Al Fawar refugee camp is different from other camps in Palestine. They're all horrific, but this one is actually the most horrific one. It's surrounded by flying checkpoints. Many don't know what flying checkpoints are, so I'll explain it. Flying checkpoints, so checkpoints are usually set in certain places, and you know that they're going to be in those places. But a flying checkpoint is a checkpoint that can occur anywhere around that camp at any moment. So there could be no checkpoint at a certain exit of the camp in the morning, but by the afternoon, there's a checkpoint. So this is what these boys are going through, and they have lived in this camp for 76 years without any hope of leaving. And so I decided to work with those boys because I can't tell them, you don't throw stones at tanks because you might get arrested or you might get beaten or killed. But what I can do is provide them with something that's going to calm them after they have faced the military. And so that was art. And so I did an expressive art therapy group with these boys, and I asked them to draw home. And most of these boys, these families who have come to that camp in 1948 actually came from the sea. So most of the children, even though they have never seen the sea, drew the sea. And then there were some who didn't draw the sea. There was one little boy, I will never forget this, who drew an erupting volcano, and that was his home, an erupting volcano. And having been in that camp, that is his home. One of the boys I worked with was killed shortly after was killed the same week that I defended my thesis. So there was a little boy. So we drew home, and then we went on to write stories and poetry. And when we went to write stories, there was a little boy. Most of the children worked in groups, but there was a little boy, and he decided to work alone. And while all the children went on to write their stories and poetry, this little boy who sat in the corner of the room, smaller than the rest, was still drawing something. And I approached him to ask him to see what he was drawing that was so important. And he had drawn a Star of David in the middle of a Palestinian flag. And I had asked the teacher to come and see what he had drawn. And the teacher asked him, why did you draw a Star of David in the middle of the Palestinian flag? And the little boy looked up at me and smiled, and he said, because she's Jewish and I like her, so she's welcome inside of my home. And for a minute, there was peace. And the teacher looked up at the rest of the students and she said, this is Sara Abusarar. She is Palestinian from Dura, Hebron. She's from the Abusarar family. You heard her speaking English because she lives in Canada, and she looks a little bit different because her mother is Croatian. And the little boy sadly picked up his pencil and he scratched out the Star of David and he left the Palestinian flag. But for a minute, there was peace. Thank you all for coming today, and I'm going to open things up to questions and comments and a discussion. We have, oh wow, we actually went longer than I expected, but we will have the next 10 minutes for questions. And well, I don't know how long we have, Henna.
We can stay, I'm happy to stay however long it takes.
Perfect. So maybe
And
the next 15 minutes or so.
sure,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's open the floor for any questions. You can either type them in the chat or you can, if you, well, go ahead and type them in the chat. And maybe I'll ask a question just to get us started for now, which is, could you tell us just a little bit more about the series of events that caused you to start storytelling professionally, and
Well,
what you consider to be the role of storytelling now as we all watch the genocide in Gaza?
okay. So I actually, my first interaction with the arts was not with storytelling. I was studying theater and I was doing acting in my many years ago, in my really young years. And then one day I realized that real life is a lot more dramatic than than theater. And I stopped doing theater. I actually quit theater school, and I took a whole semester off to educate myself on my own on topics that that I was interested in, and I decided to go into social work. And I was doing social work for many years and activism, and I dropped the arts completely. Like the only time I was doing any arts was at protests doing popular theater. But I just kind of took a completely different identity. I thought I wanted a normal life. I didn't end up getting that, and I just started um, just got myself a new life. And then when I was 30, or around that age, I was looking for a master's program for somebody else. And I didn't find a master's program for that person, but I found a master program for myself in Switzerland when I did stop theater. And I initially wanted to do art therapy, expressive art therapy, but because I didn't have a social work background or a psychology background, they wouldn't let me in. But now I was armed with a social work degree and a theater background, and I was able to go in. So I went to Switzerland and I studied studied expressive art therapy, and I took a class in my very first year. And I'm glad Linda House is here. I took a class in storytelling, and I fell in love with it. And there in that same class was a woman um, who was working at the Parent Child Mother Goose program, and she told me about that program, which is a program where we teach folk tales to mothers of babies. And she told me about that program, and so I went and back to Toronto, and I wanted to find a storytelling community, and I joined Parent Child Mother Goose, and Linda was my apprentice teacher, and Linda just opened up, like she just took me into the storytelling community and became Linda Houses right here and became my first mentor. I was so amazed with how she told her stories, and she brought me into the storytelling community in Storytelling Toronto, and I began to tell stories. And at first I was telling Croatian stories because I was actually afraid to tell Palestinian stories for the first year or two. And I wasn't sure how it would be received. And I knew wanted to, my goal was to tell Palestinian stories and maybe only those or both. But I needed to kind of gently I was the only Palestinian storytellers and gently. And so then the first Palestinian stories I told were actually the show you heard today, the collection of stories you heard today. And it was at the first featured at the Toronto Storytelling Festival, International Storytelling Festival in Toronto. And I remember telling that story. And, I was a young storyteller. The audience was fairly full, but not full, not completely full. And as I continued telling these stories, I will never forget it, that the audience just got larger and larger and larger because people were hearing that something different was happening in the room, and they came in to listen. And so then I knew that it's completely safe within the storytelling community in Toronto, not within other communities at least, to tell these stories. And so from there I started telling traditional Palestinian stories and other stories, and I continue to tell Croatian stories as well. So that's how I got into it. Like I said earlier, I didn't know that I come from a family of storytellers because a lot of my father's memories were too painful for him to share. And so when I was working on this set of stories with my father, he looked at me and he said, "It's interesting that you decided to become a storyteller." I said, "Why is it interesting? I did theater before. Theater was an extension of storytelling. All arts are connected." He said, "No, no, 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 no. It's interesting because your grandmother was a storyteller and your great grandmother was a storyteller. You come from a long tradition of storytellers on on my side, women storytellers, and none of my my aunts took it on. She said, none of my sisters took it on. None of your cousins took it on. And here you are in diaspora, and without knowing it, you've taken it on. And not only that, you're telling the same stories your grandmother told, the same folk tales." And so then I thought to myself, I don't know if I'm a good storyteller, if I'm a bad storyteller, if there is such a thing as a good or a bad storyteller, but I need to continue telling these stories because it's in my lineage. But that was the case with many storytelling families in the villages of Palestine. After the occupation, it went silent. People stopped sharing these stories. And I finally understand why, actually. Then I knew then too. I thought, well, I guess because stories are so connected to land. But now I understand it after this current genocide. I understand on a deeper level why, because I feel silenced right now. I feel I'm not as eager to share my stories. Not that I don't want to tell my stories, but I go to tell them and there's a block. It's too painful because when you're storytelling, you are visualizing more probably than other art forms. You're visualizing, you're in that place. And when I go in that place, even with a traditional story with ghouls and jinns, when I go in that place, how do I not imagine the children that are starving right now and the children that are being killed right now? I can't not imagine that. And it's horrific and it's a painful experience. But I'm pushing myself and I'm telling these stories because I've seen how these stories have stopped being told after the Nakba, and I don't want that to happen again. And I know that the storytellers in Palestine are continuing to tell these stories as well. And for them, it must be even more painful than for me.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for pushing yourself to tell these stories today. We have a couple other questions in the chat and lots of thank yous for you. So I hope you read those for yourself. But one question is, your father was such a strong young activist even as a child. So how did his activist spirit manifest as he grew into adulthood?
Yes, he really was, and all those boys were. They had no choice. But something I was just actually, I just finished reading a book from a friend of mine wrote, and it's a book on disability, and she's somebody who's been diagnosed with a disability, and and I realized that nowhere in my stories, any of my father's stories, do I mention that my father has a disability. And when I mention that my father walked from Dura, Hebron, all the way to Hebron City, he limped. My father has a metal rod in his leg. So it wasn't easy for him to walk with the kids. He stayed in that schoolyard rather than strike with the student leaders because he wasn't chosen by the principal because he had a limp and it would have been too dangerous for him to. But then with his limp, he still went to protest for the children to be released from jail, the students to be released from jail. But that's something that I never. I don't think of my father as somebody who has a disability, who limps. He never told me how he ended up with a rod in his leg. He spent a year of his life in a hospital in Jerusalem, and my grandmother and his family couldn't go to Jerusalem. You can't just simply go to Jerusalem if you're from West Bank. So he spent a year of his life when he was 10 without any family at all. But somehow, even though that was such a large part of who he was, somehow because I never thought to include in my stories that my dad limped, that my dad has a rod in his leg, that possibly he was shot because he won't tell me why he has a rod in his leg. He said he doesn't want me judging my family. Um, and so and he just doesn't want to go there, but he and then now he says I was just born that way, and that's what all that my family says to me. But he didn't say earlier that he was born that way. But I thought to myself, why didn't I think of him as someone who has a disability? Because my father doesn't have a disability, he has a limp. And he Those stories are not stories of a child who was disabled. It's a child who was very much able, who overcame not just his disability, but poverty, political unrest, trauma from a young age. That's not. Of course, I didn't think to include that he has a disability. He was a superhero, not somebody with a limp. And so he continued to be an activist in his adult life by the way that he raised my brother and I, and Palestine was always, even though um, he actually when we moved to Canada when I was 9, my last name is misspelled. My last name is Abusarar. The Abusarar came when we arrived in Canada. My mother, after a very long flight from Yugoslavia, was tired and accidentally wrote the sh sound in my name in Croatian, which is an S with a squiggly line. And the Canadian immigration just assumed it was an S. And so she that's how it stayed. And when it came time for me to get my citizenship, my dad whispered in my ear and to my brother's ear, "Keep your last name as it's misspelled." And I was like, I didn't know why, and I just did as my dad told me, and I thought he was going to do the same, but he didn't. He wrote his name properly, but mine and my brother's name remain misspelled. And the reason why is because my father was was extremely afraid that even in diaspora, my brother and I would be targeted, because my father's cousin was one of the assassinated artists from the 70s and 80s, and he was assassinated in Rome. He was an author, and he was also a politician, and he was starting a communist wing of Fatah. He was one of the founders of Fatah, and he was one of the authors. They don't know who assassinated him, if it was Mossad or Mossad's people who were actually Palestinian, but we are certain that it was an inside job, but hired by Mossad. But that I actually found out a lot more. I was in Rome just now for a storytelling festival, and I got to visit the hotel where he was assassinated. But long story short, my father was really afraid that the same thing would happen to my brother and me as happened to my cousin. It was a result of his own trauma of losing a cousin that he thought that. But that's why my last name is misspelled. But my father kept his last name as it is because it was important for him to represent his family, and he didn't mind if he was targeted as long as we weren't. But what I did find out in Rome, actually, with that assassination, when I visited that hotel, I got to go into the floor where he was assassinated. The room is no more because they had planted a bomb under his bed, and it exploded, and then obviously they had to renovate. But I did get to go in, and what I found out after is that actually my father's cousin wasn't going to stay in that hotel for that conference. It was a writers' convention. Mahmoud Darwish was with him. He left the conference early that day. And he wasn't going to stay in that hotel. He was going to stay in a different hotel. And then his good friend, who is Palestinian, said to him, no, 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 don't stay in that hotel. You are being watched. You are being targeted. You are next. Edward Said said to him shortly before his assassination, you need to, he said to Edward Said, I have been, the newspapers are saying that I am the next face for the Palestinian resistance. And he was excited. And Edward Said said, do not celebrate that. All that means is you are next. Watch yourself. And he was next. And so his friend, so-called friend, said to him, do not stay in the hotel, stay in the luxury, the most luxurious hotel, because it's got more security. So he stayed in the most luxurious hotel, and the bomb was planted. So it seems that that is the person who set him up, who was working for Mossad, but we don't know. But anyway, so my father continued to be an activist through the way he was raising us, and through his own, I think mostly through continuing through all his trauma. And there was a lot more trauma than what's in these stories. There was a lot that happened. I don't know if I answered your question, Hannah.
Thanks, Sarah. There are 3 more questions here in the chat, so I'll tell you all 3, and then you can address them however you'd like. One question is, do you approach storytelling differently on Zoom? And if so, how? The second question is, as a Palestinian storyteller, how do you navigate the complexities of conveying personal narratives while also reflecting the broader historical and political context of Palestine? Not a small question. And third is, do you have any thoughts on how each of us could become better storytellers?
All right, so Zoom. I approach Zoom very differently than I do storytelling in a circle in real life. Most of the time, I approach it very differently. I don't see storytelling on Zoom as storytelling, because the audience, that's why I said turn on your cameras if you can, because storytelling really is about community, about the circle, about creating energy together. And I like to see my audience, and I like to interact a lot with my audience, and I like to hear them breathing. I like to feel their energy. I think storytelling for me is completely, it's not about performance. It's completely about performance of the icing on the cake, right? It's a cherry on top, but it's about energy exchange. I look at the room and I can tell, oh, Linda might need this, and April might need something completely different, and Hannah, you might benefit from this, and I take from you what you can give me. I'm just the selfish. I take your energy too. But in Zoom, that's harder because a lot of people have their cameras off, and the fourth wall, there's actually a fifth, there's like 10 walls between you and the audience. And so I approach storytelling when I first, I wouldn't tell stories during the pandemic at all, because I thought, this is not storytelling. I'm not going to tell stories. I'm just not going to do anything until this is done. And then I realized I was asked to tell for the Palestine Film Festival, and it was important to me as an activist to do Palestinian stories. So I decided to do it, but I don't see it as a storyteller telling. I see it as a performance art. So what I do when I tell stories over Zoom is I see it, well, it's partly film, it's partly playing in a box, it's partly, so it's partly visual art. It's partly this, it's partly that. And the storytelling is there too. Whereas on stage, I see it, there is the story, there is me, there is the cherries on top and icing on the cakes, which are, different things, rhythm and performance, other things. But really, the story is about the energy and about connecting with the audience and feeling them. So to me, that's the difference. And not everyone would have the same experience. What was the second question again? I'm sorry.
The second question is, as a Palestinian storyteller, how do you navigate the complexities of conveying personal narratives while also reflecting the broader historical and political context of Palestine?
Well, the way that I tell my family stories, I don't tell so many personal stories, just sometimes simply because I don't think I'm interesting enough, as interesting as I can never be as interesting as a folk tale or a traditional story or a fairy tale. Like I'll never be as interesting as, let's say, a ghoul or let's say a fairy, and so I feel like what do I have to offer that a traditional story doesn't? Um, so I don't tell those as much, but with the family stories, as you might have noticed, I shape them like folk tales. I shape them in a very simplistic way. Of course, all of those stories I could have gone very complex with, and there are complexities in the tragedies, but I shape them almost like a children's story, the way like folk tale would be shaped with a simplicity, simple language, simple images. And that's because even when I'm telling my family stories, I am telling a traditional story because I'm telling a story that comes from my tradition. And folk tales are stories that originally were personal stories or stories about someone. Hannah, did you hear about Linda and what happened with her the other day? And then Claire might repeat it, and then somebody else might repeat it, and 100 years later, it's a folktale, and that's basically it. So family stories are that, and even with my father's stories, since 1948 to now, all kinds of magic entered those stories, like the story with the refugee women, how she said, Allah, when this man dies, may he not have enough water to wash himself with. And then there was not water. No, there was water, but he couldn't get to the water to wash himself with. That's completely like something you'd find in a folk tale, and so I approach them in the exact same way. So I don't actually identify myself as anything else but a traditional storyteller, even when I tell these stories, because they come from a tradition. And did I answer it, or is there more to the question?
If the person who asked the question wants to add anything else, let us know.
You answered it. Thank you so much. Thank
Great.
you.
The last question then is, do you have any thoughts on how each of us could become better storytellers?
I think each of you are already storytellers and probably amazing storytellers, because we were just talking before everyone got in, and Hannah was saying that she asked a brilliant question, which I actually never thought to ask anyone. And she asked the question of, how many stories do you think you tell in a day? Is that what you asked, Hannah? Yeah, and something similar to that. And it's just such an amazing question. And so in a day, yes, all of you tell at least at least 30 stories. And so you're all storytellers. It's just connecting to a tradition and connecting to other storytellers that came before you. So when I tell a traditional story, let's say I tell an ancient story, a myth, let's say, from Mesopotamia, let's say, or a folktale from Palestine, I know that when I am standing on stage or in a circle telling those stories, it's not me telling those stories. I'm standing there telling the stories that hundreds or thousands even have told before me. And so I'm connecting to the energy of so many different storytellers that have come prior to me. So it's not me alone. So that's the difference between telling a story, if we can call it professionally, or as a storyteller, or telling a story as a regular person who might be an engineer or who might be a business person, is that when you're telling a story in real life, you're telling a story. When you're telling a story as a storyteller, you're connecting to the energy of all the other storytellers that came before you. And I think I really would assert, the longer I tell stories, the more I would assert that that's the only difference. Do we have any other questions? There was a third question that I forgot. I'm very long-winded, so I apologize.
I think you've answered all the questions that have shown up in the chat. So unless anyone else has another question, or Sarah, if you have anything to add, we might call it a day.
Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Sarah.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and please consider donating as you head out of the Zoom room.
And the reason, like I said, I chose UNRWA is because I have a personal connection with working in a school for the refugees in the camps. All the schools in the refugee camps and all the services for children and for adults are funded by UNRWA. And so the tragedy of Canada and America and other countries cutting this essential funding is really horrific. I partly also chose this fundraiser for a political statement too, because the funding was cut. And it's a real tragedy that can and will and has already cost many lives and of children. And I mean, in Palestine, kids are really not going to school right now. In Gaza, kids are not going to school. In much of the West Bank, kids are not going to school. But we would like them to go to school again, and we would like the camps to have schools. And so please donate generously. Thank you.
Right. Free Palestine.
Thank you, Claire.
I'd also like to thank Hannah and all of the organizers for presenting this this lovely afternoon. I really a very important afternoon of stories. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you. And thank you, Sarah, for joining us. Yes, we're very happy to be able to support this event today. Thank you for coming.
Bye, everyone.